Hi class, so this video is for lab 3, where we're gonna do an independent t-test. So I will upload the SPSS. So this video is for SPSS, and from our example in class, we talked about the example in the independent t-test example. We talked about students in high school who watched Sesame Street as children versus students who did not watch Sesame Street as children. So this is an independent t-test because you have two separate groups. You have students who did watch Sesame Street versus students who did not watch Sesame Street, and you want to compare their grades in high school. And so what I did was I input that data that we talked about in lecture into SPSS. So we have each row, right, is a student, and they were assigned into two different groups. So we have 10 participants who are in group 1, which is, let's see if I input that into, so group 1, I said they are, they watch Sesame Street. So what I did was I just went to variable view, and then I went to my group variable, and I put in a label for 1 is students who watch Sesame Street, and 0 are students who did not watch Sesame Street. Okay? I'm going back to data view now. And so I'm looking at, okay, so I have 10, so I see that I have 10 participants who watched Sesame Street as children, and then I have 10 participants who did not watch Sesame Street as children. And then this is a comparison of their grades. So what I want to do first is I want to okay, so I want to go to analyze, and then compare means. And we want to do an independent t-test, and that is because we're comparing two different groups, right? So we have our group of students who watch Sesame Street as children and the group who did not watch Sesame Street as children. So we want to do an independent t-test. So the test variable, which is our dependent variable, that is average high school grade. So what we're doing is we have these students in two different groups, and we want to compare their grades. So that's our test variable, is average high school grade. And then our grouping variable is our grouping variable are whether they watch Sesame Street or not. So I want to define my groups. So for some reason, the way that SPSS sort of groups or sends out the results is the opposite of what you think. So let's make group 1 as group 1, as numerical 1, and then group 2 as 0. And then press continue. And then let's look at options. So here you can choose your confidence interval. So I talked about confidence intervals, and typically we use 95%. Just keep it that way. And so what confidence interval is going to do is look at how much our test variable can vary by. So I'm just going to press OK now. That's all we need to do. And here's our output. So as you can see, students who watched Sesame Street as children have a mean of 93. Students who did not watch Sesame Street as children had a mean of 85. All this is doing, Levine's test for equality of variances, is just looking at, there's this assumption that the variance between the two different groups, right? So we have two different groups, and if you remember in the t-test equation, the variance, how much these two different groups vary, goes into that equation. And so the assumption is we want this to not be significant because we don't want to violate that assumption, that because what we want is that these two different groups have equal variances. And if they're not, then we're violating an assumption. We have 10 participants who watched Sesame Street and 10 participants who did not watch Sesame Street. The degrees of freedom, if you remember from lecture, is number of participants minus 1 for group 1, and then number of participants minus 1 for group 2. So the total, so what that is would be 9 for group 1 and 9 for group 2, right? Because that's the number of degrees of freedom. So this is the number of participants minus 1, which is degrees of freedom for each group. So we have the total degrees of freedom for the entire independent t-test is 18 because we do 9 plus 9. So degrees of freedom for each group and add it together. We find that our t-value is 4, and we can compare that to the lecture, and that's actually the same t-value we got for lecture that we calculated. We find that that's significant, so SPSS tells you if it's significant. It looks at the mean difference, so the mean difference is describing the difference between the two different groups, so that's 8. So 93 minus 85 is 8. The standard error difference, and then your confidence level, that's what I was talking about. So the lower end and the upper end. So this is all the information you need for the write-up. So you need to, for the lab, you need to attach your output as well as your APA format write-up. So how I would save it is I press export. Oops. And however it shows up on your computer, I have a Mac, but I would export as a PDF because that's easier to deal with, and then press OK. So if you want to choose this area that you want to save it, you just press, you can save it as your, I would call it, so I have, so I'll save it like that. Okay? And then you just press OK and it'll save.